Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Yoshi Nishizaki. I'm a member of the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at NUS. I'm the coordinator of the seminar series in our department this semester. There are 4 seminars scheduled this semester, which revolve around the theme of contentious politics in Southeast Asia. Today's talk is the first of the 4. And we are very fortunate to have Dr. Walid Abdullah as our first speaker today. Let me briefly introduce Walid, whom I have had the pleasure of knowing for a long time. Walid is currently an assistant professor in public policy and global affairs at NTU, or Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore. He's one of the fine products of NUS. He received his first degree in economics from NUS, and then his PhD in political science in a joint degree program between PS and King's College London. And he was the valedictorian of the class of 2013. He's a specialist on politics in Singapore and Malaysia, especially on the issues related to elections, ethnicity, and religion. He has already established himself as a scholar in these fields. Since he was a graduate student at NUS, he has published many articles in leading journals, both disciplinary journals and area studies journals. And I'm happy to say that his first book, a single authored book, has just come out from the University of Amsterdam Press. It's titled Islam in a Secular State, Muslim Activism in Singapore. Unfortunately, Walid, strangely enough, does not have a copy of that book available to show us. Okay. And Walid has also recently published another book, a co-authored book titled Unmasking Singapore's 2020 General Elections. Yeah, he has a copy of that book. So he's showing us a copy of that book. Yeah. Right. Okay. Today, Walid is going to talk about contentious politics in Malaysia. I must say it's a pretty timely topic, as is well known. Over the last 3 years or so, Malaysia has had many messy and complicated political conflicts. And just last week, Mr. Muhyiddin Yassin stepped down as Prime Minister in the midst of political struggles within his ruling coalition. Okay. In today's talk, Walid will address the central question: given all these factional struggles and other developments, does race or religion still matter in contemporary Malaysia? Okay. And reflecting the timeliness and importance of this topic, as well as Walid's growing scholarly profile, we've got a lot of people who have signed up for this talk, just a few hundred. I have heard that's a record number for the seminar series in our department. So thanks to Walid for attracting such a big audience. Okay, so without further ado, let me hand this over to Walid. And as is usually the case, the talk will last for about 45 minutes, to be followed by another 45 minutes of a Q&A. If you have any question to ask, you don't have to write it and send it to me. Just send a message to me to say you have a question, then I'll call on you during the Q&A. Right? Okay, so that said, it's all yours, Walid. And again, good to have you today.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. And firstly, thank you to the Department of Southeast Asian Studies for inviting me. Professor Yoshi was one of my formative influences on comparative politics. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see many of my own teachers in the audience. Professor Dakila is here. Professor Mazna, who's the authority in this group. She will be correcting me if I say anything wrong on Malaysian politics. Okay, so I'm happy to be here. It's a pleasure. Okay, so today, let me just share the screen first. And this is fine?
Yeah, you want to enlarge the screen?
Yeah, okay. Okay, so today this is the title of the talk. And as I was doing up the title, I didn't know what was going on or what was going to happen in Malaysian politics. At that point in time, the handover had not taken place yet. So I will be talking about uh, whether the recent developments signify a new future or is it a return to same old stuff. And hopefully, I will be drawing on some political science theories and see what the study of dominant one-party regimes, the study of ethnic politics in general, can tell us about the specific case of Malaysia. So hopefully, there is something that political science can tell us with peculiar, peculiar, the peculiar situation in Malaysia and whatever has been transpiring. Okay, so just something to start the session with, right? And today we have Ismail Sabri, who is the Prime Minister of Malaysia, after some party hopping and individuals hopping from parties. He represents a different Malaysia in one way. In many ways, he doesn't, right? Because he is basically the first post Tim Wawasan prime minister in Malaysia. And what is the post Tim what is Tim Wawasan? So Wawasan was the name given to Anwar Ibrahim's team when it was in 1993, and he was going to contest for the deputy presidency of UMNO, the United Malays National Organization. And in his team, eventually there was no contest, so he became the deputy leader and deputy prime minister. In his team was Najib Tun Razak and Muhyiddin Yassin as well, right? And why is that important? Because when you have those characters, right, there is a lot of baggage. There is a lot of baggage that I think Malaysia has not really recovered from. Um, when we think of the situation today, some of it or a lot of it has still to do the remnants of personal animosity between characters of yesteryears. And until you see those characters go away for various reasons from the political scene, it is very difficult to envision a completely different Malaysia because that baggage is still there. So in one way, he represents a breakaway from that past. In another way, it is not, because even though he became an MP, in 2004, this is the post-Mahathir era, the Badawi era, but he was still part of UMNO. So he would still be affected by a lot of these personal rivalries, but also a lot of the ethno-nationalist issues and rhetoric that his party champions, right? So in one way, it's a breakaway from the past. In another, it's same old, right? And that is basically going to be the theme throughout this session. And of course, you have Anwar Ibrahim, who is he holds the world's record, right? Because he is the longest serving prime minister in waiting in the world. He has always desired the coveted position of premiership. At the same time, the fact that he is around, and we know Anwar is not gonna stop. He will be in the picture until he becomes prime minister or dies trying. So in that sense, you will see that there will be many of these old guard that will be around, and as long as they are around, it is very difficult for Malaysian politics to move forward. And I include him as one of them. Not just him, of course. I don't want to single him out. You have PM Muhyiddin Yassin, who has also openly said, now, a lot of times the declarations by Malaysian politicians do not amount to a lot, but it is still significant. The fact that he said he does not want anybody who's corrupt in the cabinet, and that includes Najib presumably and Zahid Hamidi as well. So Ismail Sabri, in a sense, is tied by that. He's tied by this conditional support from Muhyiddin and the people who support Muhyiddin. And you have the grand old man of Malaysian politics as well. Uh, 20 years ago, people said, oh, he won't be around for long. So who knows, maybe 20 years from now, people will still say he won't be around for long. But his age is catching on. So it is unlikely that he will have a tremendous influence in Malaysian politics. That doesn't mean that Dr. Mahathir doesn't have any influence, because the Mahathir Anwar cleavage, I call it a cleavage, right, has sort of shaped modern Malaysian politics in more ways than one, as I will attempt to explore. So even though Mahathir may not be in the picture, there are people who are loyal to Mahathir. Now, having said that, in the current iteration of this cabinet, it doesn't seem that he had that much of an influence over the outcome, or he had that much of an influence over the outcome. He, of course, overplayed his hand a couple of years ago, but I'll get to that in a while. Right, so basically, that's just a teaser, right? So the research question for this that I'm trying to explore for this talk, why has the transition in Malaysia been unsuccessful so far? And I put so far because there is a possibility that there will be a real transition in the future, right? I would caution against being too optimistic in that regard. However, there is that possibility. So let's look at the here and now. Or if I were to phrase this differently, right? Why did the Pakatan Harapan coalition fail? Why did PH fail? And what does that, the answers to this question, it will tell us about the future of Malaysian politics. Again, I am drawing a lot on comparative politics, political science theories, and the literature, and whatever has been written about dominant one-party regimes in general. Okay, so I'll just briefly state my arguments first, and then I will return to this later on. Okay, so the transition in 2018, right, when Barisan Nasional was voted out for the first time since 1957, it was not purely a rejection of race-based politics, nor was it even a rejection of UMNO. It wasn't. It wasn't a rejection of race-based politics. It wasn't even a pure rejection of UMNO, at least not for every single voter. It was more a rejection of Najib, which was made possible by the credible coalition put together by the opposition. Now, the caveat here, this is not the calculation for every single voter, but this is the calculation for a significant group of voters, which I will get to later on, the conservative Malays, which made the transition possible. Okay? And it was the introduction of credible defectors. And here there are, of course, the most prominent is Dr. Mahathir himself, a defector from UMNO that turned the tide in favor of the Pakatan Harapan, especially, remember the target group here is the conservative Malays. So the introduction of credible defectors, chief of whom was Dr. Mahathir, but not just him. You had Muhyiddin himself, who was the deputy prime minister. You had Mukhris, Dr. Mahathir's son, former chief minister of Kedah. You had Shafi'i Abdul, don't forget, who the leader of Warisan, who has a stronghold in Sabah, who had significant influence in Sabah, as I will get to later on. So the introduction of credible defectors turned the tide in favor of the Pakatan Harapan. Now, Pakatan Harapan's alliance was mainly based on what it was against and not what it was for. And this was a huge problem that eventually proved to be its own undoing. Now, this was a strength in many ways, but it was also not inevitable, but it was likely that because it was based on what it was against and not what it was for, it was likely to dismantle or disintegrate, precisely because there was no ideological coherence, at least not between all the parties. Okay, and especially related to what is going now, PH did not articulate a different racial vision for Malaysia. That is something that we need to bear in mind, or at least not PH as a coalition. Some parties within PH, Pakatan Harapan, may have had articulated a different racial vision for Malaysia, but not the coalition as a whole, which is why it was able to win, but it's also why it was likely to disintegrate. This is my argument in a nutshell. I will explain more later on. But before that, let me just briefly. So I don't really know what the. Sorry. Yeah. So I don't really know what the background of the audience is, but I'll just briefly talk about some historical realities. Okay. So the first is Barisan Nasional was in power from 1957. Initially, it was known as the Alliance. Right? until 2018. So it was a power sharing arrangement between different races, right? UMNO representing the Malays. You have the Malaysian Chinese Association, the Malaysian Indian Congress, the Sabah and Sarawak parties. So it was a multiracial coalition, but it was clearly a Malay-led multiracial coalition. So the president of UMNO is the prime minister, the deputy president is the deputy prime minister. So, and they make no apologies about it, right? So it is Malay-led multiracialism. So you have representation, you have multiracialism, but it's clear that Malays were to lead and Malays were at the forefront of this, right? And of course, later on, this crystallized in other areas as well, especially in the economic arena, where you have the Bumi Putra affirmative action policies, right? And UMNO was also pretty much a Malay nationalist secular party up until 1981. Now, some people have disputed this statement of mine, including Professor Hairuddin Al-Junaid, who said in his book Islam in Malaysia that, yeah, it's essentially true that UMNO was secular, but the fact that they pandered to Muslims and Islam showed that there was an undercurrent of Islam that was too strong to be ignored, and therefore you cannot really say that Malaysia was truly secular. But okay, so I just wanted to be intellectually honest and say that, but you can say from the rhetoric, from the policies, that UMNO was a Malay nationalist secular party up till 1981. And yes, they did pay tribute to Islam. They did talk about Islam as the national religion, but they didn't govern in that particular way specifically. It became Islamized after Dr. Mahathir took over. He became prime minister for the first time in 1981. And in 1982, a significant event took place, which basically turned the tide, or it changed the flavor or the face of UMNO forever, and I would say Malaysian politics forever, and that is the co-optation of a young firebrand Islamist known as Anwar Ibrahim, right? Who at that time, he was then the leader of the Angkatan Belia Islam Malaysia, the Malaysian Islamic Youth Movement, ABIM. And a lot of people were a bit surprised that he joined UMNO, because a lot of people thought that his natural inclination would be towards PAS. But of course, Anwar Ibrahim has gone through several iterations of his several ideological and personality iterations over the years. But that was how it started, and you can see that UMNO and the state became more and more Islamized over the years. Right? And Professor Joseph Liao says this: once that door to Islamization was open, you couldn't close it back, because it took a life of its own. Okay? So that's the background. And what happened in 2018, right? So there was an alliance between the Democratic Action Party, the Parti Keadilan Rakyat. So the DAP is a secular party that is Chinese dominated. The PKR is a secular party which is Malay dominated, right? You have Amanah, which is a splinter party from PAS, the Islamic Party of Malaysia. You have Bersatu, which was Mahathir's party, essentially a splinter party from UMNO. And you have Warisan, led by Shafi'i Abdullah, who was also a defector from UMNO, right? One of the top people in UMNO. And that's significant. The fact that of this, in this alliance, right, you had three parties. Bersatu, that was led by Mahathir, an UMNO defector. Warisan, led by Shafi Abdul, an UMNO defector. PKR, don't forget, is led by an UMNO defector. It's easy to forget that, but that defection took place a long time ago. Well, he was sacked and all, but he's essentially a defector, right? Why is that significant? We'll get to that in a while. And of course, they won in 2018 after Najib's 2.6 billion ringgit scandal. But they lost power after the Sheraton move last year. And it is significant if you look at the defectors that I talked about, right? The people that I mentioned. Mahathir, former Prime Minister, right? And Muhyiddin, former Chief Minister of Johor, and the Barisan lost Johor. Mukhris, former Chief Minister of Kedah, they lost Kedah, and of course that's Mahathir's influence as well. Mahathir is strong there. Shafi Abdul, strong in Sabah, later on became the chief minister of Sabah. They lost Sabah as well. So these are not insignificant defections. It's not just Mahathir. The other three, especially maybe not so much Muhriz, but Shafi'i and Muhyiddin was significant as well. So what do I draw on, right, to explain what's going on in Malaysia today? I'll just try to be mindful of the time and try to finish before 45 minutes. So there are two main bodies of literature that I am drawing on. So the first one, and these two are interrelated, of course. The first is what political scientists call the field of transitology, right? And this is the study of democratic transitions. And broadly, I mean, this is a very well-established field of study. There are two main groups of reasons why transitions happen or do not happen, are successful or are not successful. The first would be incumbent strength, and this includes co-optation, the ability to co-opt, electoral fraud, economic growth, which gives a lot of legitimacy, repression, legitimation, and elite unity. Okay, so you can underline that part, right? Virtually, elite unity, which I will get to in a while. And opposition weakness. Uh, so the first group of reason is incumbent strength. Secondly is opposition weakness, right? So inability to form a coalition. So if the opposition is able to form a coalition, they are more likely to win. If the opposition has credible candidates, they are more likely to win. If they have better strategies, they are more likely to win, right? And the reverse is true as well. And the perennial problem is what I call the lack of experience or the first job problem, right? So imagine a fresh undergrad who is applying for a job, and the employer likes the fresh grad, has all the potential in the world, has a good CV, but the employer says, I'm not going to employ you because you do not have experience. And then the fresh grad says, how am I ever going to get experience if that's all people say about me, right? So it's a catch 22, right? So you did not get the job because you do not have experience, but you're not going to get experience until you get the job. And that is the problem for the opposition in dominant one-party systems, where the country has only known one government, which is the case, which was the case in Malaysia from 1957 to 2018, the UMNO-led Barisan National Government. One of the fears for voters, even if they dislike the government, but the opposition is untried and untested. So this lack of experience. And there are two ways to overcome this lack of experience. And you can make the comparison to Singapore, right? In Singapore, one of the ways is not really relevant. But in Malaysia, this is relevant. So in Malaysia, you have state government. So if the opposition can win a state assembly and they form state government, they can show to people, okay, they have some experience in governance. But even then, it would still not be enough to compensate fully, because governing at the state level is different from governing at the federal level. So how do the opposition, or how do opposition parties in dominant one-party systems overcome this problem? Through credible defectors. Through credible defectors. And when you have a credible defector, that's when you overcome the problem of lack of experience. So when Anwar Ibrahim defected to the opposition can say, we have a former deputy prime minister. He knows how to run the country. Don't worry, he was the finance minister. When Mahathir came over, we have a former prime minister, the most successful prime minister, right? So no problem. We know how to run the country. That is how they overcome the lack of experience, or the first job problem, as I call it. Okay? So I draw upon that body of literature, especially the elite splits. Secondly, opposition coalitions, and this is a subset within the first body as well, because there is a body of literature including Professor Elvin Ong from NUS Pol Science. He works on this in dominant one-party systems. And why is it difficult? Even though coalitions, if you form coalitions, you are more likely to win. But why is it that opposition parties tend to not form coalitions? Because there is a cost to joining forces with others. And that is an ideological cost, but also a material cost in terms of losing votes. So let's use 2018, right? Bersatu, led by Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, the DAP, led by Lim Guan Eng, and of course his father Lim Kit Siang, who's still around. And a DAP voter may be dissuaded from turning up for a Bersatu candidate or even a DAP candidate, since they could potentially have compromised on their beliefs. Right? So as late as 2010, when Mahathir had stepped down as Prime Minister for the first time already, Lim Kit Siang said that Mahathir is the #1 racist in Malaysia. So when you say that that person is the #1 racist in Malaysia, and you have all sorts of quotes, right, from all the different parties about each other, right, then it's a much harder sell to your own base, right, that, okay, yes, he was the most racist and most corrupt person at one point in time, but now he's the best person to lead Malaysia, right? So there is a cost to forming coalitions. I'm just giving the Malaysian example, but this is well established in the literature. But in spite of the cost, parties would still form coalitions when they believe the benefits clearly outweigh the costs. So, so let's think of two examples, right? Mahathir Anwar as opposed to Pritam Singh and Chee Soon Juan, right? And Pritam Singh Workers' Party, Chee Soon Juan LDP, and one of the things that happened before the 2020 elections, a lot of the journalists, they were talking about why an opposition coalition doesn't take place. And they said, oh, is it because there are so many egos in the opposition? Which is true, of course. If you are going to be a politician, there will be, and there is a different type of character to you, right? You would have to have some ego, right, to be a politician in general, especially opposition politician. However, it cannot be, right? I mean, does anyone really think that Pritam Singh and Chee Soon Juan have bigger egos than Mahathir and Anwar? So it cannot be. And do Pritam and Chee Soon Juan hate each other more than Mahathir and Anwar hate each other? No, they don't. Right? So why is it possible? And this is what I say. Right? I used to say in the past, I used to say, if DAP, a secular Chinese-dominated party, can work together with PAS, an Islamist party, then there is no reason any party cannot work with any other party. But today, I don't use that example anymore. I say, if Mahathir and Anwar can come together to be in a coalition, anybody can come together with each other, right? So why was it possible? Because they had made the calculation that there was an actual chance of toppling the government. If that calculation wasn't made, then there is no way they would have aligned, because there is a cost, reputational, ideological, and even material in terms of the votes. So, okay, so based on those two bodies of literature, right, and you can see where I'm going just by using those theoretical frameworks, right? So, as I said, it was not even a rejection of UMNO. It was more of a rejection of Najib, made possible by the credible coalition put together by the opposition, especially by the conservative Malays. Now, we have estimates of the Malay vote, right, in the 2018 election. Pakatan Harapan got less than Barisan Nasional as expected. Of course, the Chinese firmly with Pakatan and other minorities as well. But the Malays, you only needed 25 to 30%. Only needed 25 to 30% to win, and the rest of the votes were for PAS. Right? And PAS, of course, in that, during the election, they tried to play the role of a spoiler, basically to hurt Pakatan, because there was already an informal alliance between UMNO and PAS, right? So the in some areas, without PAS, the UMNO candidate would have lost, including Khairi Jamaluddin, for instance, right? Would have lost without the third candidate, right? So the introduction of these 4 credible defectors for the conservative Malays to get this 25 to 30%. The Chinese and the others were going to vote for the opposition anyway. Of course, you'll have some Chinese who vote for Barisan Nasional. Yes, you'll get. I'm talking about generally. They were going to vote for the opposition anyway. You just needed a small number, a significant but small number of Malays to vote with the Pakatan. Right now, the hatred towards Najib is an important push factor, but you still need a pull factor, and the introduction of these credible Malays Mahathir Mohamad, who is a Malay nationalist, Muhyiddin Yassin, former deputy leader of UMNO and Prime Minister, Mukhriz Mahdi Shafi Abdullah as well, right? Vice President of UMNO. So you have people with enough credibility amongst the conservative Malays, and they are thinking, okay, as long as this, and I've interviewed some of them, as long as you have Mahathir there, I am still confident that Malay rights would not be affected, right? Because he has a proven track record, right? So I do not trust DAP. I do not really trust Anwar, but I really detest the DAP. But Mahathir sorts of allays my fears about Malay rights. So essentially, PH's alliance was based on what it was against, not what it was for. Right? There was no ideological coherence. DAP and Bersatu have different ideologies. Bersatu is essentially UMNO 2.0 or 3.0, right? So Bersatu is a Malay nationalist party with UMNO members. The constitution is almost like UMNO. Even the name itself is almost a translation of UMNO, United Malays National Organization, right? PPBM. And the two are ideologically worlds apart. And even PKR2 is different from Bersatu, although PKR is more malleable, right? Don't forget last year when Anwar said he had the numbers to become prime minister, right? He had the numbers. He was quick to emphasize, that, or he was keen to emphasize that the government that he is going to be the head of was going to be a Bumi Putra based government, right? Now this goes against the multiracial vision that that they seemingly articulated. But again, PKR is more malleable. They would probably go where the wind is, and that was where they were smelling. So yes, so even though PKR has a slightly different ideology, but not a big deal. But DAP's one is more ideologically disparate compared to Bersatu. And of course, there's the curious case of Amana, which also is another case of elite split, right? Because Amana is basically considered the more liberal, quote unquote, faction within PAS, and they defected and they formed Amana, so to speak. So PH did not articulate a different racial vision for Malaysia, which was why it was able to win. Because if it did not, it would not have gotten, or if it did, it would not have gotten the conservative Malay vote. But because there was no ideology that held it together, so it was united in its hatred of Najib. After that, then what? Right? Which was why it was likely to disintegrate, right? And to draw on this, I also use, to make this argument, I also use this extremely important important paper by my friends, Kai Oswald and Stephen Oliver from Yale NUS. Kai is in UBC. They talk about 4 arenas of political contestation in Malaysia. You have East Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak. You have the Northeast, Kelantan and Terengganu, which is dominated by PAS. You have peninsular diverse, so peninsular districts that had a more than 50% non-Malay population. And you have the peninsular Malay. Peninsular districts outside Kelantan and Terengganu, there is more than 50% Malay. Okay, so for them, Kai, Oswald and Oliver, and I agree with them, East Malaysia is not that significant in the grander scheme of things. Not that it's not significant by numbers. It is. It's just that East Malaysia would go where the peninsula is. So they are willing, the Sabah and Sarawak parties are willing to form coalitions with any governing coalition. Okay? The Northeast is dominated by PAS. Difficult for other parties to get a stronghold there. The Peninsula diverse, most likely they would lean opposition, right? So the the areas with a non-Malay majority. Now is the Peninsular Malay. This is what is most up for grabs. This is the area, this is the arena that is most significant for political contestation. in terms of determining who is the government. Okay? So because you do not have the ethnic integration policy in Malaysia, right? So you have ethnic enclaves or areas with different ethnic majorities. So if you look, this is a map. By the way, this is from their paper as well. East Malaysia, you see, East Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak. And then you have the past areas, and these are the non-Malay majority areas. And this, look at how many seats. Of course, there's all sorts of things going on, right? Gerrymandering, malapportionment, all of that to tilt the favor, the tide in UMNO's favor. But of course, they didn't win. Still, it's significant that if you look at the table, the Peninsular Malay, 95 electoral seats up for grabs, right? The Bumiputra percentage is 71.8%. And therefore, you already see that to form the government, you need to win the Peninsular Malay seats. A lot of them are conservative Malays. A lot of them at that time were disillusioned with Najib and UMNO, but not with the old UMNO, not with UMNO as, not disillusioned with UMNO's governing principles. They were disillusioned with UMNO as it was in 2018. And Mahathir represented a throwback to the original of pure UMNO, right? So for them, it wasn't a vote for a new vision of Malaysia. It was a vote for the old vision of Malaysia, which Najib sort of had bastardized. So just based on the numbers, right, to win, you need significant elite splits, right? Based on the Peninsular Malay seats that I was talking about. And elite splits overcome two problems. One, I already said, well established in the literature, the lack of experience. So this is for any country also, right? And there's also a reason why people were excited when Tan Cheng Bock, who represented the most significant defector from the PAP since independence. I remember after Mahathir, the Mahathir-led coalition won in 2018, I think TOC, one of the online outlets, the day after, ran a piece which said, can Tan Cheng Bock do a Mahathir? Right? Because the similarities were there. Both are defectors and so on. But Tan Cheng Bock ain't no Mahathir, right? He is not at that level. He was in the PAP Central Executive Committee, but he was never a minister or anything. Right? It's not the same level. But you can see why people were the pro-opposition people were somewhat enthusiastic, because elite splits have traditionally resulted, or it can result in regime transitions. Okay? So one is a lack of experience. Second, specific to Malaysia, is the conservative Malay vote. Because Malays who wanted to vote against UMNO but were not assured by the opposition's commitment to protecting Malay rights. And there's a lot of mistrust, partly due to misinformation and propaganda, partly due to actual statements made. There's a lot of mistrust on the part of conservative Malays against the DAP, right? And that's just something I found throughout my field work. People who were downplaying it, I think they really underestimated how deep this mistrust is. DAP is sort of the boogeyman. Even the video that was released between Najib and Khairi during the election, right? Khairi specifically said the DAP-led government, right? It was clear to UMNO the boogeyman was DAP, because they know that this is something that would resonate with the conservative Malays. Right? And the presence of Mahathir, a credible defector, and others helped them overcome this fear. However, this means that the opposition was not ideologically united from the start. And when the enemy is no longer there, there was nothing to hold all of them together. And serious questions started developing about race and religion. So if you guys remember Lim Guan Eng, who was then finance minister, and this also didn't go down too well, right? You had a Chinese finance minister. Of course, people forget that the first two finance ministers in Malaysian history were Chinese, right? But it's been a long time since you had a Chinese as finance minister. But when Lim Guan Eng issued his trilingual statement, there were a lot of conservative Malays, even those who were supportive of Pakatan, were saying, oh, what is this going on? And even when Mahathir was asked to comment on it, he didn't say, oh, There's nothing wrong with it. He said, and I'm quoting, "It's a minor mistake. I don't want to make it an issue. Sometimes we make mistake. Uh, we make mistakes." So even he didn't say it wasn't a mistake, even though he was trying to downplay it, right? So there were issues about race and religion that had not been ironed out. And it was impossible to iron them out because all of them had, or at least Bersatu had different ideas. Bersatu, which is the smallest party, but it was the prime minister's party, right? And they won because of that party. So it wasn't a party that could be ignored, this difference in ideology. Now, elite splits, right? And this is one of the oldest, and I remember it was Dr. Yoshi who, Professor Yoshi, who introduced me to this reading as well. And he quotes this a lot, right? There is no transition whose beginning is not the consequence, direct or indirect, of important divisions within the authoritarian regime itself. O'Donnell and Schmidt wrote about this in 1986 with reference to Latin America. And you see this throughout the world as well. Now, it's not necessary or sufficient, but a lot of times it is. It is the case that when you see regime transitions, you see elite splits before that. And it's precisely to overcome the problems that I talked about earlier. However, elite splits, of course, they are a double-edged sword, right? Because without elite splits, the transition would not have happened. But once the culture of elite split is there, it would not go away, right? And of course, it's not just a culture that arose out of nothing. It is that the institutions in Malaysia reward elite splits. So two particular institutions. One is a mass party structure, and this is something that has plagued UMNO for the longest time. In UMNO, there is a contest, and there used to be vibrant contest for the presidency of UMNO. So for the prime ministership, essentially, because if you are president of UMNO, you are prime minister, right? So, and in 1987, 1988, there was a contest to Dr. Mahathir from Tengku Razali Hamzah, and UMNO split into two, right? Team A and Team B. And eventually UMNO was outlawed until Mahathir basically caused a constitutional crisis, right, by sacking the bench, because the judge had actually ruled UMNO to be an illegal party. So actually the current UMNO, right, is UMNO 2.0, right, because it's UMNO Baru. That was what it was registered as, but eventually people dropped Baru from the name. But the point here is, because there are contestations for the top leadership, the party is more likely to split, because you are forming factions all the time. Whereas if you look at a cadre party like the PAP, leaders are not elected, they are selected. The SecGen chooses basically the successor, right? You just need to be elected by the cadres to be on the Central Executive Committee, the EXCO. But even then, if you lose, if you do not get the top 12, you can still be co-opted. You can still be co-opted by the party, right? So essentially, you do not have to be popular even within the party. Of course, you have to have some legitimacy. But that kind of structure ensures party unity, the cadre party. But the mass party, which is why Malaysian parties are always susceptible to elite splits because of the mass party structure. Right? Of course, there is no anti-hopping law. So this is the thing: you can retain your parliamentary seat uh, even if you change a party, right? So what Muhyiddin did, what Ismail Sabri did, legally, constitutionally, it's not wrong. So it's not illegal, it's not unconstitutional. For me, of course, it's unethical, because people don't just vote for the candidate. Well established in political science, people don't just vote for the candidate. Yes, people vote for the candidate, but they vote for your party, they vote for your platform, they vote for your coalition, they vote for who's going to be prime minister. But when party hopping happens, right, you are betraying the people's vote. But that is allowed to happen because there are no anti-hopping laws. And if you gave me a choice, right, there is one law that you can change in Malaysia today, right? There's only one law. I would institute this, right? If you change party or you are sacked from your party, of course there are problems with this as well. If you change party, you lose the seat by election, right? And unfortunately, you have an institution that reward party hopping and splits. And of course, you cannot look beyond the Mahathir Anwar rivalry to explain what is going on in Malaysia today. Mahathir resigned essentially because he didn't want Anwar to be prime minister, right? So he wanted to be prime minister, but he also didn't want Anwar to be prime minister, right? So I never felt he was enthusiastic about handing over to Anwar from the outset. And even if you talk to people from Bersatu, they were already uncomfortable as early as 2018. I remember I was talking to some people from Bersatu in London. At that time, Anwar Ibrahim went to London, and a couple of people from Bersatu were telling me, uh, he's behaving as if he's the foreign minister, when he doesn't even have an actual cabinet position. So they were already, as early on as 1 month or 2 months after the elections, there were already hints that this was going to happen, right? Now, coalitions, right? Shifting coalitions, there is a cost of aligning with another party, losing your base or part of your base, right? And now you see that there is a Malay alliance, right? There is a Malay alliance, the UMNO PAS Bersatu alliance, which of course made possible by the four arenas argument put forth by Kai and Stephen. And UMNO is the kingmaker now because of this, right? Even Bersatu was essentially UMNO, well, UMNO 3.0, right? So a Malay-based party is the kingmaker, although the caveat is it is a weakened kingmaker, right? UMNO is no longer UMNO in the past, where essentially it could do whatever it wanted. Now it has to horse trade and so on, but it's still a kingmaker because of the four arenas and the Peninsular Malay and the conservative Malay still wanting Malay rights to be there. Okay, I'll just quickly take about five minutes, hopefully. Okay, so even in future iterations of coalitions, right, UMNO is unlikely to wither away. And there were some people who are predicting that after 2018, UMNO would collapse. But I think the experience of dominant one-party regimes elsewhere would have told us that that was never going to happen, right? The party doesn't go away. Now, some points to consider that I think that it's important to understand what's going on in Malaysia today as well, right? So the first is the role of the Agung, right? The monarch, the Sultan. The Agung can pick the PM based on who he believes commands the support of the majority of the house, right? So essentially 112 seats out of 222, right? So that's 222 parliamentary seats in the Malaysian parliament. So 112, the magic number, right? And if you really think about it, his role has been given more importance than it should. A constitutional monarch should have in this crisis, right? However, in another way, you can say that he has been pretty restrained in exercising this power, right? Because you can see that perhaps if it was somebody who, I mean, I won't mention names, but it was somebody who was less restrained, you can think that probably it would have been more interventionist. So is there value to a constitutional monarchy? As people, I was, they are having this debate in the UK. They've been having this debate all this while. So I'm obviously, okay, not obviously, but I am not in favor of having a constitutional monarchy, right, in any country. However, I can see why some people would be, especially, post Brexit. You saw that the monarch that is seen as above party politics, right? It can have a galvanizing impact or symbolic unifying effect on the nation. So maybe there is some value there, right? Now, intergenerational cleavages, right? And I have not so far mentioned this fella, Said Sadiq, right? And what about role, not just Said Sadiq, but people like him, right? Uh, who are basically calling for a new vision of Malaysia. How far would they go? And especially the younger generation. Obviously, there will be intergenerational changes. There are. Younger people are more amenable to this. However, I would caution against exaggerating this, because just because you're young doesn't mean you do not want to retain Bumiputra rights, right? Because there are many young people who vote UMNO and who are UMNO Bersatu members as well, right? But also think of how we always think of Malaysian politics through personalities. Even when we are thinking of having breakthroughs, we think of having breakthroughs through personalities, right? Which of course hasn't worked for us, hasn't worked in the past, right? People have put faith in personalities so many times, and these personalities have never lived up to those expectations, but we continue to do that anyway, right? So party structures, I already talked about it, but I think it's worth reiterating that the mass party encourages elite splits. You will see more elite splits in all of the parties that have this party structure. And the taking away of rights and the pushback, right? This is something very natural, and I'll just give my own personal experience, right? Over the past year, I have somewhat been involved in a national controversy here, right? Um, okay, national discussion or discourse, right? Not controversy. Uh, about the usage of the term Chinese privilege, right? And I am just talking about using the term privilege, my co-author and I, which we didn't even invent. People before us have talked about. And yet there was so much pushback against us. There was support, but there was a lot of pushback as well. Even from people whom I never expected would push back against this. Now, this is just a term. Can you imagine if there were actual rights at stake, as is the case in Malaysia, right? I mean, and also this is established in political science as well. It is much easier to deny a person the person's rights rather than to take back that person's rights, right? So it's easier to just not give somebody something rather than give and then later on take back, right? The former is much easier. You'll have pushbacks for both, but the former is easier to deal with. The latter is much harder to deal with. So my point is, this will always be an issue. Malay rights will always be an issue. Bumiputra rights will always be an issue. The position of race and religion in Malaysia will always be an issue. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there will be a pushback, and that is to be expected. And DAP is the boogeyman uh, amongst the conservative Malays, and they will play this up. They have played this up all this while, and they will continue to play this up. The Malay-based parties, I think, and that's something that DAP has to contend with. How exactly do you move away? And especially, I think not just DAP, but all of the parties would do well if their seniors were no longer in charge, and they are free of the baggage. And the other thing is the Muhyiddin government and now the Ismail Sabri-led government is the first time in Malaysian history where you do not have a strong Chinese party in government. The MCA is around in both governments, but the MCA is a shadow of its past self. And this is a recipe for social disaster. Even though Barisan Nasional was clearly problematic, racially problematic, Malay-led, it wasn't truly multiracial, but there was some version of multiracialism, and there was a strong Chinese party in government. You do not have that anymore today. And again, that is a recipe for social disaster. So what does the future hold? Final slide, okay? And then we'll get to Q&A. Based on whatever I have said, so the picture I am painting is really quite a pessimistic picture of Malaysian politics, because my conclusion is, based on whatever I've talked about, it is unlikely that race-based politics will dissipate anytime soon. Yes, generational differences are there, but important to not exaggerate these two, I think. And also, we all know as people get older, they also become more conservative. So that the generational cleavages may also take on a different flavor in the future, right? Political dynasties, the same players today were the same players 20 years ago, and that's a huge problem, right? So you look at Anwar and Mahathir and Muhyiddin and Najib and so on. It's a Southeast Asian issue, right? Political dynasties, but this generational baggage would persist, right? So how do you overcome this?